So welcome everyone to a Green New Deal for Portland session number 4, the second class on policy. Tonight, you just get me and you just get digital, so maybe not as fun as all of our exciting co-hosts, but I'm going to talk to you today basically about the last 10 years of climate policy in Portland. And I'm going to try to do it in mostly a narrative format and mostly in a way that's chronological so that it makes sense in time. And Samuel has graciously volunteered to be the co-host and chat moderator tonight. So as things are going along, please feel free to interrupt by asking a question, and I'm happy to stop and talk more about any of the topics as we go. My goal is to also have a good amount of time at the end of the session for some more detailed questions as well, but I'm happy to take them whenever. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. Get started. All right. Is that viewable for everyone, or at least for Sam? Can you see all this stuff? Can you give me a verbal?
Yep, looks great.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So before we dig into storytelling, I'm going to start with just a few terms just to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what these things mean. So first term is resolution, and a lot of climate policy at the city and the county level is done by a resolution. And what this means, what a resolution is it is an official act. It's something that's voted on by the city council or the county commission. And it's an official decision, opinion, or policy. Usually it's assigned to so-called ministerial and administrative acts, which are directives to city staff, maybe a general policy framework, or an appropriation, like a budget appropriation. And so a lot of times resolutions will get passed declaring a big set of policy goals. And sometimes people who are a little bit more hardline about such things, which does include me sometimes, will say, well, this is just a resolution. It's not the same as a binding ordinance. It's just more of like an opinion. And that is technically true, but also resolutions can be used and they can be a tool for making things happen. So today and then next week as well, I'll tell you about if you get a resolution, maybe that's all you have the political juice to get in any given time, you can still make a really good use of that by mobilizing movement energy toward making sure that it applies and that it's enforced. And then an ordinance, that's a legislative act of local government. So for things that are more permanent and general, so it changes the city code and it can regulate conduct, it can prohibit conduct. And this is defined as law under the Portland City Charter. So it's more like a level more serious than a resolution. You can't just ignore, you could, let's say that there's turnover at the city council and a new city council doesn't really care about resolutions that a past city council passed. They can kind of ignore those and set new policy. In an ordinance, you can't do that. You actually still have to follow the letter of the law. So it's more binding and has more effect. And it does more than just regulate the internal workings of the city or county. It's sort of regulates outward. And then there's city charter, which probably a lot of people are, at least in Portland, are familiar with recently. Sorry, my dog is gonna bark because we just amended our city charter pretty substantially. But this is like the constitution of the local government. It's high level, permanent rules and procedures. They're harder to change. You usually have to get everybody on a commission or council to agree to change them or refer them to voters to change them. Every 10 years in Oregon, we have charter review commissions in our local governments. And so there actually are a fair amount of opportunities to change these things, but they're also defined as law. It's like an ordinance plus, I guess. And they're changed far less often. Then we have land use decisions. And in Oregon, we're in a, as we learned last week, we're in a heavy land use state. Land use law through Senate Bill 100 and its progeny are woven into our local and state laws. And so land use decisions are ways that zoning ordinances and zoning rules are applied in a case-by-case basis. And those are things that require due process when they happen. And kind of like a level below that are administrative decisions, which are have less ability to be interpreted and are supposed to be more clear and objective, and they have lower requirements for due process. And telling you about all these things because they'll be words and concepts that we use to talk about things that have happened at the city. Okay. So Portland has been a climate leader in some ways for a long time. And Portland was, I think, or at least claims to be the first city that came up with its own climate strategy back in 1993, and that was called a global warming reduction strategy. It set out some action items that the city could take to reduce carbon emissions. And then in 2001, we passed a local action plan. So that was like a little bit more of a in-depth plan. And that plan has been updated twice since then, in 2009 and then again in 2015. And it was set to be updated again in 2020, I believe. But basically, the politics plus the pandemic made it so that they hadn't updated the climate action plan. So we're doing climate policy through other means. But this is the way that when I came to understand local climate politics and policy, this is the way that it was done, is through the climate action plan. And they're big, gigantic documents. They're really interesting because of the empirical data that they collect and the ideas that they have. And they basically like create priorities and put them in action items and then sort of assign them rough timelines as to when they should be implemented. They're not self-actualizing, which means that they require the city council or the county commission. These are usually joint plans. The most recent ones are joint between the city and the county, but they require acts of the local government to implement them via resolutions or ordinances. And so even though they're very interesting documents, I found them to be frustrating when I first started doing climate law and organizing in Portland, because they basically do all the low-hanging fruit and avoid all of the confrontations with big polluters that are going to lead to political fights. And once you get through low-hanging fruit, like at some point you have to have the political fights that get really intensive. And in my opinion, the longer you delay them, the more intensive they get. And so actually the period of the last 10 years has been probably more intense because people have been more politically activated and are trying to push for more serious policy. So I do a lot of work on trying to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. And sorry, there's a bunch of noise in my house right now, but there is, so I've been working on this for like 12 or 13 years in Portland. And what fossil fuel infrastructure means, you can take a narrow or an expansive interpretation of it. For me, I like to think of it as all of the extraction equipment and drilling equipment, refining, the pipelines for shipping, the trains for shipping, the storage facilities, the transloading facilities. Transloading means to move from one form of transportation to another. So from like ship to rail or rail to a storage tank. those things are pretty solidly in the category of fossil fuel infrastructure. And then also in our community, people also consider things like highways as fossil fuel infrastructure, because there's a lot of fossil fuels that goes into the construction of highways, maintenance of highways, and then also the automobiles that drive on them are still largely overwhelmingly fossil fuel powered. So sometimes the folks that do the anti highway expansion type advocacy will use the terminology of fossil fuel infrastructure. And this became an important issue for us around 2012, 2013. Oregon's not a fossil fuel producing state. We have some gas reserve, but they're very, 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 very small compared to other regions. And so that you could only do like highly localized extraction if you wanted to. Like there's a gas like field out in Columbia County, I think, or something that's really small. And they might not even have extraction, they might be storing there. But the global energy economy started to transition in the mid 2000s to the aughts, basically because when George W. Bush was president, we passed some laws that really expanded and accelerated the rate of drilling, especially for gas. And other fossil fuels federal lands were leased for much cheaper, and fossil fuels are basically given away to coal, oil, and gas companies. And so most of this was sold as energy security. So trying to get off Middle East oil was the thing that everybody used to talk about. And in fact, most of it was for international sale. So the region that's between all of this fossil fuel extraction and the Asian markets that were growing the fastest that were demanding it is the Pacific Northwest. And so people started studying this. This map was produced by an activist group called Portland Rising Tide, and Sightline Institute, which is a think tank out of Seattle, produced this graphic and did a study talking about the cumulative carbon impact of something like, I think there were 28 fossil fuel terminals that were proposed all at the same time for basically like storing and moving these fossil fuels to Asian markets. And the carbon intensity of those fuels cumulatively was like 5 times the impact of the Keystone XL pipeline. And that was a pipeline project going through the middle of the United States, Canada, for tar sands from Canada. And that was considered to be climate game over from a climate science standpoint. And so this was, for climate-minded people, this was like an existential threat to the region. And so we began to organize ourselves as a movement to try to stop these things from being built. And we're largely successful. And I shared some of the stuff in the syllabus, but there's been a lot of talk about the thin green line movement, the successes of that movement. And in Portland, for a while, we didn't really have anything that was going on. We do have a lot of legacy fossil fuel terminals where things are stored in these big white tanks in Northwest Portland. And then in like 2013, I think, if I remember correctly, a company called Pembina, a Canadian company, went public with a proposal to build a propane export terminal at the Port of Portland. And basically, it would have been one of the biggest investments in city history. It would have brought in propane and stored it at the port, and then piped it across a riparian area to put it on ships to go wherever it was going to go to be combusted for what it was going to be combusted for. And people got wind of this and were very upset. It was something that the mayor at the time, Charlie Hales, signed off on. It was sold as a climate-friendly project because at that point in the climate discourse, natural gas was still considered to be a transition fuel. That the science on that has caught up and it's no longer considered that. But at the time, there were large parts of the climate movement that actually supported gas projects because at least it wasn't coal or oil, and they thought that it was better. And so there weren't really any big green organizations that stepped up to fight this. And the city council, the mayor was in support. And so this was the beginning of what the climate movement that I, came into and was a part of that became very powerful over time. This was our first fight, basically. And so people began to get organized, and people started showing for hearings. It just so happened that under city code, you're not allowed to transport hazardous materials over environmental zones, and a riparian zone is an environmental zone. So piping propane over a riparian zone is a no-no. And so in order for the city to allow this project to take place, they had to weaken the environmental rules of the city through the Planning and Sustainability Commission, and then ultimately a vote by city council. And so from an organizing standpoint, that gave us the opportunity to organize ourselves in a public meeting. And basically, even though the sort of policy question was very narrow, should we change our environmental laws to allow this to happen, we use that as a referendum on the project in its entirety. And like a lot of young people came, a lot of community members, some organizations like Columbia River Keeper and Portland Audubon, or now they're called Bird Alliance, I think, showed up, and we mobilized tons and tons of people. And we ended up losing at the Planning and Sustainability Commission. They voted by one vote that changed at the end to approve this project. But the amount of organizing that we did was so overwhelming and intense that basically the mayor got bullied out of his support for the terminal. And I'm just, because I don't have time to go into it, I didn't put the normal images that I do, just like the the silly things that we were doing. But it was we did a lot of different kinds of actions, really intense actions, and a lot of people were paying attention. So Charlie Hales basically said, I was a supporter, but I'm not anymore. And he pulled his support. And then basically the project ended up dying because nobody else would put it on city council because it was too toxic. And so this was the first major victory for this kind of like new, young, energetic grassroots climate movement in Portland, was beating the Pembina propane export terminal. And then while we were doing that, because we were aware of the regional plans to build all of these fossil fuel terminals, we knew that the potential for more of these terminals to be proposed was very likely. And so the climate action plan at the time was up for, it was on its like 5-year renewal cycle or whatever. And so they were taking public comments. And so all these hundreds of people, thousands of people that were signing on to say no to Pembina were also supporting our ask to create a policy around fossil fuel export facilities. And that ended up getting into the climate action plan. So it lent us some more credibility when we went back to the city and asked for things. And then in 2015, in the winter, 2 resolutions were passed. One was about oil trains, that said that it's the policy of the city to oppose all project proposals that would increase crude oil from being transported through city of Portland. And then the second said the city will actively oppose the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure whose primary purpose is transporting or storing fossil fuels in or through Portland or adjacent waterways. I think these were the first of their kind anywhere in the United States at the time. So that was pretty cool. And then the following year, after a big process, the city passed what are called the fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments, which prohibit new large storage facilities for fossil fuels at the so-called critical energy infrastructure hub in Northwest Portland. So again, this was the first that we knew of, like the first general fossil fuel storage ban anywhere in the country at that point. And it's been, some of that has been reproduced elsewhere, but this was the first thing. And so we immediately got sued by the fossil fuel industry and the local Chamber of Commerce and a bunch of other folks. And after a 7-year legal fight at the state level, the law was actually just affirmed by the Land Use Board of Appeals. And so the state level fights look like they're over. And then right around that same time, represented by the same law firm that was representing these other interests, the state of Montana jumped in and sued the city of Portland over the fossil fuel ban. I'm pretty sure we're going to win, but we'll see what happens. And then this one's in federal court. So the theories basically that they were advancing were that the city didn't go through the proper basically the proper procedure when it passed the policy. It didn't make adequate findings. And then their big argument was under what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause of the US Constitution, that says that cities aren't allowed to discriminate against out-of-state commerce. And so basically all of these people from Idaho and elsewhere said, you're being mean to us because we're out of state, and that's what's really happening. You don't like us because we're not from here. And they couldn't prove that ultimately, so they lost on that constitutional argument. So that law exists, which is great. And even though it wasn't fully in law for the last 7-8 years or until 2023, it's still, because of the organizing that went behind it, for a little bit, Portland was kind of known as the place where fossil fuel infrastructure projects go to die. So much so that nobody really tried after we passed the law, even though it wasn't fully legally implemented. So the power of the movement itself was such that it was, it just like what served as a deterrent, I guess. And then in 2019, the county commission passed a no fossil fuel infrastructure resolution as well, which set out some direction to study the harms of a potential, or the risks associated with a potential earthquake to all of this aging storage infrastructure in Northwest Portland. And they did a risk analysis around that they published in 2020, and the findings are on the screen here. But basically they said that it would be a humongous oil spill right in the center of urban area, comparable to the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. So basically like the largest oil spill in the US inside like a city boundaries. And the cost would be like many billions of dollars as well. Would cause like generations of environmental damage to the Columbia River. And then the county passed another, or they did another study in last year that focused on toxic releases from the same area, and found that like in an earthquake, something like 1,000 people could die from toxic releases, and other people would be like turn sick. So anyway, the county's been doing a lot of work studying this problem, which is extremely helpful. And then we're hopeful that they'll turn to regulation soon as well. And there may be some things coming that way. So after the fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments passed, then activists were very pleased with themselves and had a lot of power because we built through a lot of deep community organizing. And so, and we didn't want to only say no to things, we wanted to say yes to things as well. And so in 2017, partially spurred on by the election of Donald Trump, and partially because of some like really immediate needs around a fight of what was going to replace the retiring Boardman coal facility. PGE, the utility, wanted to replace it with natural gas plants, and a lot of community organizers didn't want new gas infrastructure. And so the city passed and the county passed joint resolutions declaring a pathway to 100% renewable energy, full community-wide by 2050, with some interim goals. I think it was 2035 for full like buildings to be electrified. And these were really interesting. I mean, on their own, they were very good, I thought. And there was a lot of community engagement, and it was a good declaration. And it's definitely seen, it had ripple effects pretty much right away, both in terms of the advocacy around it was really strong, and um, community organizers, with the help of a friendly city government and a friendly county government, were able to put pressure on the Public Utility Commission and Portland General Electric to basically cancel these gas plants that they had planned to replace the coal-fired power plants at Boardman that were supplying electricity. And so even though the city's renewable energy resolution was like a non-binding resolution, it's just a policy trajectory, and we can't regulate utilities, you know, the state has an agency that does that. Just the pressure of that organizing, combined with like the city like putting pressure up the chain, was enough to have a really, really significant impact on making sure that new fossil generation didn't replace retiring fossil generation. And so PGE, as a utility, actually had to have a big cultural change to this, and they ended up firing their executive director and hiring a bunch of staff that had knowledge in what's called deep decarbonization. So like really intensive kind of like ways of decarbonizing communities. And so their utility transformed a lot because of the pressure from the local climate movement and its expression of its will through city and county bodies. And then in 2018, right around the same time, with similar momentum in the community, the Portland Clean Energy Fund was designed and put on the ballot. And you can see to the left of your screen the organizations that designed it and were on the steering committee for getting it passed, and then sort of its initial stages at getting up and running. And this was a huge success. It was something that organizers tried to get the city government to pass so that they didn't have to use money to go get signatures and defend a ballot initiative. But city officials didn't want to do it, except for Chloe Daly. But one vote is not enough. You needed 3. And so they ended up going to the ballot, and they ended up winning big. They got 65% of the vote. And what the Portland Clean Energy Fund initiative said is that retailers, sorry about that, retailers with over $1 billion in sales annually and over $500,000 in revenue in the city pay a 1% surcharge on their city gross revenues from retail sales into this fund. And then the fund funds clean energy projects and clean energy jobs training. And both of those categories you can dig into and see there's a little bit more qualification, but this is basically what it does. And then this fund would be overseen by a benefits committee that I believe currently has 9 members. And one of our attendees tonight is actually one of those members of the community, the committee, and probably will be able to tell you in a lot more detail about some of the stuff than I will be. So Maria, feel free to chime in if you hear me saying anything that you'd like to clarify. And then, so the program started getting up and running and started basically developing the administrative capacity to do what it was set out to do. Pandemic hit, just like a year into it getting started, so that wasn't helpful. And then the business press started really going after PSEF during the pandemic from like a political standpoint. And there was an audit from the city auditor that was pretty sensationalized as like a reason why PSEF should be like, canceled or gutted or massively amended. This is what the audit said. It was actually kind of standard for new programs, but it was presented in the media as though it was like a really existential problem that was happening in bad faith, in my opinion. And But the city basically responded by doing some sort of like targeted reform efforts. And then last year they PSEF created a 5-year spending project that would kind of like forecast, because everyone was complaining that PSEF was bringing in too much money, which is like the greatest problem that you could ever have as a program like this. But people started complaining, oh, it wasn't expected to bring in this much. What are you going to do with all this money? And so there's a lot of pressure on the committee and the staff to come up with ways of spending that money, you know, rather than just kind of like handing it back to the city for general budget stuff, which a lot of people wanted to happen. And so he came up with a 5-year plan that had like really creative and interesting ways of spending lots of money that would, you know, serve the purpose of the program, the climate justice purposes of the program, in the ways that are described here. So renewable or energy efficiency, renewable energy tech in affordable multifamily housing, planting trees, making schools more resilient, and then giving some money to city bureaus and offices to use as leverage to try to get money from IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law. So there's a lot more, but those are some of the high-end takeaways. And now the kind of like most recent news is that folks on the commission, like Commissioner Renee Gonzalez, have been talking about putting PSEF back on the ballot in some way to try to like cap the amount of money that it can take. And the response from the community has been, no, don't do that. We like PSEF. There's a big rally yesterday or on Tuesday. Yesterday was Tuesday. And people showed up to basically say, you know, don't do that. But one of the ways that's kind of being negotiated presently is that some of this PSEF money is going to cover budget shortfall, but not just as like a general appropriation, that there will be money that goes to projects that are actually going to be in line with the city's climate goals. So bureaus that have basically like projects but are currently unfunded, and that would kind of like help cap a budget need. People got really creative about moving some of that money. And so this budget cycle will actually rely a lot on PSEF money funding climate projects as for balancing the budget. And I'm just going to stop to see if Maria wants to add anything in the chat while we have somebody who's really close to this process.
Maria says you've covered it.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Even after yesterday's rally, still keep showing up.
Great. All right. So, so instead of the, so I mentioned before that we used to do things through the climate action plan. And after these like codes and resolutions and then the Portland Clean Energy Fund, basically what happened is that city staff and city elected officials were kind of, let's say they were sort of like bumped down in the hierarchy of importance of whose voices mattered in this, because movements were so effective and powerful that rather than having the city basically like set out these big, huge plans, the work kind of started to be more about like community designing solutions for problems as we go. And then the city staff kind of responding to that. Changed a little bit since the pandemic, honestly, because that was so disruptive in so many ways. But instead of doing another climate action plan in 2020, the city passed a climate emergency resolution, which restated a lot of what was stated in the 2017 resolution, but added a lot of language around justice and basically, I would say like harmonized or at least attempted to harmonize bureau and city policy with the goals of the Clean Energy Fund to have a really justice fronted approach at solving climate problems so that people who are most vulnerable get resources up front. Um, and so this emergency resolution was then in 2022 turned into a work plan. And so the bureaus now, and most of this work goes through the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, but there's also a fair amount in the Portland Bureau of Transportation and in the Bureau of Emergency or of Environmental Services and others. So, but they're doing it basically through the lens of a climate emergency work plan is how they're trying to set their priorities. And so a lot of these priorities are things that are either coming from like discussions inside of PSEF or from the 2020 resolution. And so it's interesting. It's more, I would say like organic and community led than it was when I started doing this, which is good. There's definitely tension around this, and I don't think that city staff really like to be told what to do by community like groups and people and nonprofits and stuff like that. So there's definitely tension around that, and there's a dance to do. I'm always happy to talk to people about how to approach the city and try to get something. Um, Although I'm not doing a ton of work at the city right now because I think the council is terrible and they're, as you'll see a little bit when I start talking about Zenith, we've mostly been at Breach, at least, and some of our partners, we've been in a more like hostile relationship with the council over the actions around Zenith. So it's a lot harder to like play those games that we used to play. But you know, hopefully things will get better here with charter reform. Um, so yeah, I'm going to talk a fair amount about Zenith because for me, this is kind of like it's a fight that's been going on for almost 5 years now, and which is really frustrating because it's something that it's like a Houston-based oil company transloading facility that made an investment in Portland. They purchased a asphalt facility and then proceeded to change it into an oil terminal without anybody saying that they could do that, right? There was no like decision at the city or the state that said they could do that. And our law that I mentioned before, the fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments, it didn't apply because that prevented new storage terminals from being built. It didn't prevent somebody from adapting existing storage terminals. Or in Zenith's case, they built new rail racks so that they could move like more volume through just sort of efficiently unloading things. And that the law that we passed in 2016 didn't address that. So they kind of found some loopholes in local law and state law, and basically just like kind of overnight started operating an oil terminal and lied to regulators about it repeatedly and said, oh, don't worry, we're not going to increase the amount of oil throughput that comes through the city, and then have done so 5 years straight. Every year they're increasing it. And there were some interesting decisions early on. I mean, people were pissed about this right away. There were big rallies. There was a big, sorry, my dog's drinking water right next to me. There was a huge event at University of Portland's arena, or one of their lecture halls or big lecture halls, that like sold out and was fully full, and all the city councils were there, and they all pledged that they were going to stop Zenith. And yeah, community opposition was just huge. People blockaded oil trains at Zenith's site and got arrested and built a garden on top of their rail tracks and all this stuff. And those people got like acquitted when they got tried for trespass because juries in Portland didn't want to convict climate activists at that time. And so, given how overwhelming community opposition to Zenith was, you know, like where we're at now is very disappointing. But we won before we lost, I guess. So after all of this was going on, all this community pressure was ramping up on Zenith, the city made a few decisions that were important. First, Zenith asked if they could amend their franchise agreement with the city. And a franchise agreement is like anybody who wants to use the public right of way, either going under or over it for anything, they have to get a franchise agreement and they pay a licensing fee to the city. So Zenith had one and they were like, we want to build new pipes under Front Avenue to move fuels to the, next facility over so we can transport them. And the city said no to them under pressure from activists. They were like, no, thanks. Like, we're not going to do that, which was huge. And then in 2021, they denied what's called a land use compatibility statement. So it starts to get a little bit technical here. So I'm going to try my best to not use technical jargon in describing this, but if it starts to get a little bit too sort of like in the weeds, I would love for people in the chat to tell me that so I can slow down and explain things. But basically, all of the controversy that's happened since 2021 has to do with Zenith's air permit renewal. Every 5 years, you're supposed to get a new air permit. And myself and another environmental lawyer were able to convince the Department of Environmental Quality, the state regulator, that when Zenith applies for a new air permit renewal, they need to get a new land use compatibility statement from the city. And a land use compatibility statement is it's a decision that basically no one ever uses in Oregon. It's kind of like up until 2021 was just like a box that like a bureau would check. But the city is allowed to say whether a facility that's applying for an air permit is in compliance with their land use laws. And that's even though it's an air permit, like our land use laws are built in such a way that there is like a land use oversight at the local level for a state permit. This is unique to Oregon. So we went to DEQ and we said, look, this was an asphalt facility that became an oil terminal. The use and intensity of this site have changed dramatically in these last few years. How can this possibly comply with local land use law? You should require that they have to go back to the city and basically like ask them for a new land use compatibility statement. And DEQ agreed with us, which was shocking. And so when Zenith was looking for its new air permit, they said, go talk to the city and get this land use compatibility statement. So they submitted an application to the city in 2021 in the summer. And kind of shockingly, well, I would say we kind of expected them to do the right thing, but it looked like up until about a day before they ended up denying this land use compatibility statement, we thought that they were going to grant it. That's kind of what the whispers we were hearing out of the city, but we had so much pressure coming from community members and legislators and Multnomah County and neighborhood associations that it was just too overwhelming. And Dan Ryan, who was ahead of the bureau that was in charge of this, basically just like buckled under the pressure. And so Portland denied Zenith's land use compatibility statement. The massively important because if Zenith can't get a land use compatibility statement, they can't get an air permit. If they can't get an air permit, they can't legally operate in Portland. So, a couple of days after this, the Department of Environmental Quality starts to institute proceedings basically to like cancel Zenith's air permit renewal process. And then Zenith predictably sued the city and, said, you can't do that. You're not allowed to say no to us. And, using different legal arguments. And they sued at the Land Use Board of Appeals, which is where you have to go on land use decisions. In the Land Use Board of Appeals, well, I should say also Columbia Riverkeeper and Willamette Riverkeeper, two environmental organizations, did what's called an intervention into the lawsuit. So they petitioned the court to allow them to basically team up with the city to defend the city's decision, and we're allowed to do so. So the city and two environmental organizations went up against Zenith in order to defend their decision, and they won at the Land Use Board of Appeals. Land Use Board of Appeals said that absolutely the city can deny a land use compatibility statement, even if it's only using its comprehensive plan. And Zenith didn't like that for obvious reasons, and so they appealed to the Oregon Court of Appeals, and the city and the environmental interviewers won again at the Oregon Court of Appeals. So things were looking really good in 2022. And then Zenith appealed to the Supreme Court. And that's when everything started getting really insane. So basically in the summer of 2022, like, you know, the major issue in the lawsuits was that the courts were like, yeah, you have the power to do this. We just need you to do like a little bit more work. And they basically were like, show your work, like tell us why you're going to deny this, give us more factual information. And those were things that the city, in our opinion, could have easily done. So we were waiting for the Supreme Court to agree with the Court of Appeals and LUBA and defend the city's power. And then we would go back to the city and like help them basically write defensible findings for their denial by Zenith. And then in September of 2022, we start getting these like kind of like whispers in the form of press releases from Zenith about a new land use compatibility statement that they're filing with the city. And everyone's kind of like, okay, that's weird. They're in a lawsuit with the city. What could possibly be going on here? And then in October 3rd, we get this like announcement from the city of Portland that they've approved a land use compatibility statement for Zenith that includes all this renewable fuel stuff that nobody's ever heard of. And yeah, so everyone's just like, what is going on? Aren't you guys are in a lawsuit against one another and somehow are approving a second Lux? Like, how is that even legal or possible? And then like 3 days later, the Supreme Court issued a decision upholding the city's power to deny a Lux. So we're just like, red flags are popping up. It doesn't make any sense at all what could possibly be happening here. And we start asking the city, like, why did this happen? What happened? We want you to change your mind. We want you to hold some public hearings. They are allowed under Oregon law to revoke a Lux anytime before a new air permit is granted. So we were like, revoke this. This is bullshit. Like, let's have some public hearings. Like, you know, like if Zenith's offering you evidence about renewable fuels or safety or whatever, you should give us the opportunity to rebut it. Like these people are lying all the time. They're always breaking the law. Like, what are you doing? You're just like gonna freeze out the community. And they were like, go fuck yourselves, basically, is what Carmen Rubio's chief of staff, Jillian Choney, told rooms of people. They're like, we outright refuse to reconsider this decision. So if you don't want to talk about that, then, you know, get out, basically, is what she said to people in a closed meeting. And so people were just like really confused, I think, for a little bit, trying to get our feet under us and what happened. And then in the summer of 2022, me and a couple of journalists started doing some really intensive records requesting of the city, like basically like a full month of like records requesting and just kind of like, you know, using every search term that we could possibly come up with and figuring out how to get what we wanted about Zenith. And we ended up getting a lot of really interesting stuff. So basically the city had represented publicly, they were like, this was just like a normal administrative decision. Like Zenith sent us a new Lux and we looked at it with clear objective eyes, and out the other end we had to approve it because it was good, and that's all there is to it, is what they had said in public. And it turns out that's not at all what had happened. There was a ton of lobbying that was going on from the city or from Zenith and their lobbyists at PacWest Communications while there was a lawsuit that was going. The city was the city met at the oil terminal site, like in a closed door meeting where they only reluctantly gave us notes after they denied that any notes existed. The same chief of staff for Carmen Rubio said that. Um, Denied that any notes existed, and only after like, repeated records requests did we find some handwritten notes of a staff member at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, which showed what had happened at that meeting in part. Um, and basically there was just like a lot of law breaking and the city hiding these conversations with Zenith and basically like trying desperately to hide what they were doing from Columbia Riverkeeper, Willamette Riverkeeper, and all these other environmental entities because they didn't want us to interfere with their plans, basically. And you're not allowed to do that, it turns out. So, at least in my legal opinion. And so this got published, and then we started sending letters to the Department of Environmental Quality saying, hey, like, you all have the power to look into this under your administrative rules. Like, why don't you do that? And they refused. And so now we're petitioning what's called the Environmental Quality Commission to basically force Zenith to do its job. To force the city to do its job. And they are gonna consider our petition next Thursday at the Environmental Quality Commission. And Multnomah County wrote to the state as well and said, hey, we agree with all these activists. We want you to look into this stuff and tell us, basically like use your powers to make right what happened at the city. So
We did get a question. How did Rubio and Ryan benefit from this?
I get this question all the time, and I would love to be able to say something like, yeah, they got like a big payout or something, because I think in people's minds that would make more sense, right? Like bags of cash being exchanged, but it's actually, I think, like more banal than that. I think like from Ryan's perspective, because Ryan was the commissioner in charge, even though Rubio's office was like doing most of this, Ryan was still the commissioner in charge of the Bureau of Development Services, which is the entity that made the decision. And I think he just like doesn't care about this issue. And he was mad that climate people put pressure on him in 2021 and that legislators were like mean to him and demanded stuff. So I think he'd had a weird grudge. So I don't think he like cared. And so I think he was like kind of happy to step out of the way and let anybody else come up with a plan. And I think from Rubio's perspective, her chief of staff is kind of like a hard nose. I think she's conservative, actually, like player in politics. And I think that they knew that Rubio was going to run for mayor even back in 2022. And I think they were trying to like show that they were like the people that could do the negotiations with industry, right? For a big climate victory, right? We don't have to say no to these guys. We can just like, negotiate and then we'll all get what we want kind of attitude. But mostly like an ideological and a political position that the best we can do is just like please the business lobby, right? Like saying no just feels too scary for most people who are in government because they've been trained to not do that. Sam, what's up? I see a hand raised. Sam?
I think you can unmute him individually. I don't have host power, so.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to do that somehow. Sorry, everybody. Oh, I can. I'm going to allow. Go ahead, Sam.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, on this, I would say I worked in the mayor's office on like during the time when Nick was talking about the University of Portland sold out event in the auditorium there. And University of Portland is a very strategic location for that kind of city council meeting because it overlooks the critical energy infrastructure hub, aka the area where Zenith is going to build on a liquefaction site And so you would overlook kind of this mass destruction and hazard area. And I think that that I just want people to understand like organizing and advocacy works, and that in order to get that, there were hundreds of signatures and letters that went into City Hall requesting that public meeting that evening. And so I do think there was yeah, I think it does make a difference to get a bunch of signatures to show that residents are tracking this, that they're not dropping it, that they care about this. And that was the main reason why that sort of meeting was scheduled. And I think it really gave the city an opportunity to show to Zenith, hey, this is something we can't just rubber stamp. Like we have an obligation to our residents, and that's our job. And so it ended up having, I think, a different tone than what I've seen on these sorts of issues, where I think there are two schools of thought on if you're an elected official. Is one, I'm going to go into office and really go to bat for my community and really advocate and stay close with them. Or, oh, I'm going to use my position to try to negotiate with my community. And that's why I'm there, is to try to assuage concerns that my community has, and I'll basically try to be the peacemaker or the gatekeeper on those. And so I think it's just kind of two different approaches. But anyway, I really want people to understand like all the pressure did work. I think right now, especially in a post-COVID era, city council is very insulated again. They're not having city council meetings or city hall town halls like they used to in the past. And that, I think, is a really big issue, because then now you have chief of staffs and commissioners saying, well, I'm not going to go into that neighborhood association or this coalition meeting because they're just going to ambush me, instead of saying, oh, I have an obligation to go out to the people and hear what their concerns are, and understand that they're not necessarily taking it out on you. They're trying to give you power to go against these massive corporate interests that are lobbying you. So, yeah, anyway, thanks for letting me chime in.
Yeah, really well said, Sam. And I think the point you made about the change that came with COVID is really important when thinking about the climate movement. And there's different pieces of the climate movement. I think that we generally do a pretty okay job working together across issue areas, but like the Rubio didn't really have to campaign when she got elected, and wasn't really like active when the climate movement was like really flexing its muscles, right? And I think the same is kind of true of Dan Ryan. And then, like Sam was saying, during COVID, people weren't organizing at all except for like the protests downtown for police accountability. And so like they're just like all of this like knowledge about sort of like the past mobilizations, the intensity, and like the ability for like thousands of people to be mobilized was stuff that was just not in their minds. And so they didn't think of us as like an interest group that was as important as we had been used to being either. And so, yeah, all of these things kind of together, like yesterday we did a media training for Zenith at the 350 office, and somebody asked the same question. And I was just like, I mean, honestly, the way I kind of think about it now is like Rubio made like a series of assumptions about the world that she was operating in and the politics, or her chief of staff made these assumptions, and she just got like every single one backward, basically, right? Like, oh, like business community, like calls the shots, got to appease them. And it's just like, well, maybe in a COVID world where nobody's talking to each other and they're only getting like negative advertising and they're not, there's like community is so interrupted. Maybe that's more powerful and you see that as being more powerful, you know, but like in before that, and hopefully now that's not how it is. Or like the climate movement, they're just some like old enviros that, you know, get angry every once in a while. It's just like, no, we're like a really deep bench movement in Portland, like a lot of people and a lot of people in institutions who care about this stuff, in government institutions and private and nonprofit institutions. And so yeah, it's the perspectives were not accurate, and I think bad assumptions were made. And then the most kind of like generous interpretation, which I don't think is correct, but I'm going to offer it anyway, just out of fairness, that maybe somebody else would think this, is that they actually thought they were doing a good thing, and that they just didn't understand that when a fossil fuel company says the word renewable energy, that might not necessarily mean a thing that their community would like. And so they're just like, you know, there's an answer that's basically like they're kind of like in this position of trying to negotiate an outcome to a difficult position, and they hear renewable energy and they're like, oh, environmentalists would like that, you know, kind of thing. The reason why I tend to not have that as my interpretation is just because of the lengths that they went to hide things from environmentalists until everything was signed and dotted, because you would think that they'd be more eager to be like, hey guys, we're like striking a deal, come celebrate this with us, since that's more or less how the city operates. So I think that for me is like a factor that says they probably didn't think that. But
and one more thing, Maria asks, if an adverse event occurred, would the city share responsibility?
that's a good question. It's a good question for lawyers that do trial work, that I don't really do. But I think you could make a strong argument that the amount of knowledge that elected officials have about the risks of Zenith and other fossil fuel terminals from the last 10 years of people submitting it to them over and over and over again, that if there were a terrible event, I don't think you would be on totally unsolid footing if you were going to go after sitting like former or current elected officials in their personal capacity. Basically is like doing like flagrantly risky things and unreasonable things. So those would be like, I think they'd be tough legal fights. But in the past, I have actually really pissed off a county commissioner one time because I started talking like that, not in like a threatening way, but I just thought it was like a compelling talking point. And then she was like, are you threatening me? And I was like, no, I'm just saying. So I don't usually use that talking point as much, but yeah, I think that there is a logic there. It's not completely straightforward, but it's possible. Any other questions in the chat?
That's everything right now.
Okay. So yeah, Zenith stuff is really interesting. I mean, from a movement perspective, it's been really frustrating because we've just been, and I think, you know, others who are on the call have different issues with the city as well that overlap with climate justice. That's just been really frustrating. We were like, when Sam and I were at the city, and then after I left and Sam was still there, like it was just a pretty good time to be doing climate work in the city. Like even on stuff that like policymakers felt was risky, right? Like when they first heard ideas, they were still like very open to working with communities and community organizations towards solutions on problems. And so like, yeah, and it was just, I mean, most of the climate issues that I presented here were like 5-0 votes on city councils and stuff like that. And so the difference between that and now is really striking. And so there's a lot of kind of like movement rebuilding and movement remembering and honestly like cultivation of new leaders and things like that that needs to happen. But yeah, Zenith is like was my canary in the coal mine kind of thing. When when they switched, I was like, okay, like we don't actually have power on this council anymore. We need to get back in the business of building power, is kind of how my brain interpreted it, which we're going to talk about a lot next week with Damon Mott's story. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. We've been talking about fossil fuels like oil, coal, gas, big terminals, and stuff that goes in your cars. I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about fossil fuels that go in your homes, because this has been a really interesting terrain of struggle as well. So in 2021, Multnomah County, by resolution, prohibited the use of fossil fuels in new county buildings. And what that means is gas. And basically, the science around gas, I mentioned earlier that in 2014, people still, it was kind of like on the back end, tail end of people still thinking that gas was a transition fuel in a climate sense. And now that's just like obliterated. Nobody who's like a studied climate advocate or city official or county official like really believes that kind of stuff anymore. So the county actually was just like, okay, well, one step we can take is in our buildings, when we build or remodel them, we're not going to add gas anymore because of the climate impacts. And it turns out that natural gas, not only is it bad for the climate in terms of carbon emissions, but it's actually really unhealthy in a lot of ways. And combusting methane inside of your house turns out to not be good for you. And even just having a stove in your house, even when it's not on, it's leaking benzene and other chemicals, carcinogens and toxics into your home environment. And so the combination of those two things, of when you're using and cooking versus when it's just off, there's a lot of science that's come out in the last just like 5 years that's really changed the game on how people are thinking about gas. It also ignited a culture war because, of course, the fossil fuel industry was easily able to like mobilize people to be like, you know, if you touch my stove, it's like taking my guns kind of thing. You can pry my gas stove for my cold, dead hands kind of attitude popped up in media about some of the stuff. But nevertheless, on a scientific level, there's just like so much more knowledge now about the impacts of gas. And so in 2022, Breach Collective kind of initiated a project of doing a scientific study, and we brought in some doctors and researchers and a bunch of other organizations that do climate, energy, climate justice work. And we all basically teamed up to co-publish a report on methane gas about health, safety, economic, and climate impacts. Yeah, so we just like self-published a report. It was awesome. It's still around. Some of the stuff's out of date because there's so much more science that's happened in the last 2 years, but as an organizing tool, it was really effective. And one of the offshoots of that was that Multnomah County ended up doing their own literature review and came up with, sorry, I can't see all this. I'll move this out of the way a little bit. It's a quote. It says, our review of the most recent scientific literature found conclusively that gas is a health hazard, especially for children with growing lungs. Protect against pollution-driven respiratory problems. We recommend a transition away from combusting appliances in favor of healthy electric alternatives whenever possible. And this, of course, made the gas industry really angry, and they were threatening to sue the county, even though they hadn't taken a formal action. They just published a report. But Northwest Natural in particular is a gas-only utility. Most utilities are some kind of mix of gas and electricity. So Northwest Natural, like if gas is unhealthy and we don't want to use that, it's basically like an existential problem for them. And so they are just like pouring money and trying to bully anybody from doing the right thing and transitioning away. They become a known climate villain very quickly, both in terms of media and in the advocacy community. I was just reading today I was reading in the Oregonian that this year they had the second most political contributions behind Phil Knight of anybody in Oregon. So they're just like trying to buy people away from regulating them. And also there's a bunch of reporting that's happened in the last like 6 months about them sending people to Scandinavia on these like 5-star supposedly like learning trips to learn about how Scandinavians are doing like biogas, and we're going to do exactly the same here in Northwest Natural, even though that's complete bullshit. Like they're not planning on doing it anyway, the way that the Danes are doing it, but they basically are like whining and dining legislators in foreign countries and stuff and trying to curry favor with them. So they're expending so much money, intimidating, lobbying, like buying the political process right now because they're terrified of the future. But anyway, in response to this report, they hired they hired a scientist, basically like a scientist who works for industry, to come and testify at Multnomah County on the day that that health report was released. And the New York Times found out about it and wrote an article with what I think is like the greatest headline I've ever seen from an advocacy perspective. So it wasn't in the online version, but this is what the headline was in the print version. Gas stoves are just fine, claims the scientist paid to say so. But yeah, there's a big expose on like these scientists that gas companies are hiring to try to dispute the science. And yeah, so there's still big fights that are going on in that world. Basically, so what happened, California has been passing a lot of these local ordinances restricting new fossil fuel infrastructure for gas, which basically means they're stopping like new hookups to homes. So like they're saying like you have to build electric only buildings. And Eugene passed an ordinance like that in 2022. And then Northwest Natural spent $1 million to pay some like out of state signature gathering firm to come in and like gather signatures to refer it, because you can do that in Eugene. And they were going to have like a ballot fight, which I was pretty eager to have actually with Northwest Natural, because I think we might have won, even though they have so much money. Eugene's a really good community to have that fight. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard an appeal, a legal challenge to one of the California gas bans, and made a Trump appointee and a Bush appointee made this like horrific decision where they applied an Energy Conservation Policy Act, which is a law that was basically about like saving energy, to like use it as a defense of the gas industry, and basically like obviated the strategy that Eugene was pursuing. And so they had to withdraw their ordinance because it was clearly illegal at that point based on what the Ninth Circuit had said. So the court system basically like gave us a terrible decision, and it really took the winds out of the sails of what was like a pretty strident growing movement. And so this world is kind of like pushed more into administrative advocacy and elected officials, just because of the amount of money and power that Northwest Natural have, are getting scared away. And so it's a pretty frustrating time. People are lobbying the county to try to get resolutions passed now and having a hard time. And then the city, I've got all these records that I haven't published yet, but I'll give you a fun taste of them. The city is just like getting lobbied heavily by Northwest Natural in relation to a program called HART standards that they had been advancing. HART is an acronym. I always forget what it stands for, but it basically was around like building efficiency and also like internal emissions in homes and like existing in new buildings. And the program started with like a year of like environmental justice community engagement to like prioritize and set policy concerns. And then like they had a stakeholder thing that Northwest Natural was always in and complaining in. And then basically like they had this like really good like democratic justice-based process that they went through for like a couple of years. And then Northwest Natural is basically just like killed everything through political power. And because the city council is so bad, there's like no other champions that are gonna bring things forward. And so we might get like one little tiny piece out of this brought before the council, which would be like gas health disclosures in the city of Portland. But compared to kind of like where we should be now, it's like, I don't know, it's very disappointing that that's sort of the level of things are at right now. So anyway, that's kind of where these campaigns are at. The science is definitely on our sides. The economics is actually good. Gas because the alternatives that they're proposing are like blending in biomethane and eventually like hydrogen into their gases are going to be really expensive absent like enormous subsidies. And so rates are going to continue to increase. And so if electric utilities can get their shit together and keep their systems from collapsing, they'll be way more competitive on that level as well. So yeah, there's probably more to say about that in Q&A if folks want to, but I'll leave it there for now. And then the last thing that I'll mention, I think this is my last slide, is there's one other like interesting attempt that climate advocates made, which was after the first round of the city charter amendments at the city of Portland, where we established districts and ranked choice voting. They were doing a part 2. And one of the things they were looking at was restricting fossil fuels in the charter, because community organizations had really advanced that in a aggressive way, in a good organizing way. And we got pretty close, but they lost some commissioners and they weren't staffed correctly, so they didn't refer it to the ballot, unfortunately. But I put in the syllabus kind of what breach collectives language was that we had recommended. And basically what we were saying is like, you could, by charter, you could actually like write environmental justice into law in a really meaningful way. And you could also like, match that with things like rights to nature if you wanted to, rights to a clean environment. And you could really like advance the transition away from fossil fuels. Because one of the problems with regulating just by ordinance is that fossil fuel infrastructure is like spread out all over the place, right? And there are different kinds of decisions that are going to be implicated depending if you're talking about like a gas utility or an oil terminal or like transportation related stuff. And so the idea was that if you had some like overriding directives that were in the charter around this, then those would kind of like have to necessarily, because the charter's above like these ordinances, and arguably you'd have to like update the comprehensive plan to be in line with stuff like that, that you could basically like bootstrap in more directives around energy transition through the charter. And so it didn't happen, but it's still an idea that exists out there. And so, you can always go gather votes to change the charter or put something in the ballot. People have done it successfully. It's kind of costly sometimes, but if you've got a nice movement of people, it's not impossible. So I'm going to stop there in terms of presenting and just kind of see how y'all are feeling, and if you have questions that we should talk about. Yeah, Brian, I see you. I'll unmute you just a sec. All right, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. So I was one of the people advocating for the climate phrases and wording in the charter, and I remember us aiming in that direction, but I don't recall really what came of it. Did that make it in some form, or did that get dumped?
It got dumped. We basically they had a big list of different items that they were going to approve or deny. And I think we were like fell one vote short or something like that. Yeah. It was pretty close. And it was like because they had lost 3 members of the charter who were just kind of like burned out, overworked. And so, we just like, because it was on the tail end of the process, we just kind of like lost because of attrition.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I thought, but I couldn't remember the dynamics of it now. Thanks.
Sure. Nat is asking in the chat, are there other West Coast cities with their own CEI? And if so, what can we learn from them about resistance to big oil? Yes, there are on the West Coast and in the Pacific Northwest, as it turns out. I mean, I don't think any are as concentrated as ours are per se, but we like tend to build our fossil fuel infrastructure like right next to waterways and on fill soils, just because that was like when people were doing this construction starting like 100 years ago, that's where they would put it. So it is fairly common, but like fights against it are, I think they're more advanced in California, probably, where they've had fights with refineries for a lot longer, for example. And in the Bay, there are a lot of storage and refinement facilities. And so people have been studying and fighting those for a long time down in California. But like nobody, I mean, California is probably the state we'd have to look to for where the big kind of like changes are happening the fastest. And Sam, you might even have more to say about this than I do, having worked in the state and stuff. But I think like a couple years ago, they actually passed a law that's going to stop new oil drilling in California, which is, you know, still like fairly big part of their economy. And so like they were like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. And they're going to like think they had plans for like phasing out the oil production, which is huge, both just in terms of like impact, but also like the hypocrisy elements of being like a big fossil fuel producing state, and also like, you know, the biggest evangelist for like the transition and climate action. So yeah, and what's kind of unique here, and maybe not totally unique, I bet California has problems with this too, but it's not necessarily the climate issues that are prompting the like need to get rid of this infrastructure as fast as we should. It's because of the seismic issues, right? And so and I don't think anybody's like studied these issues in depth like we have. And that was one of the other things, that the movement was strong enough here that we could like get budget allocations from city and counties to like pay for like really well done professional studies so that we have good data in order to make these decisions. And that's hard because a lot of places they don't want, if you start studying problems, then you have to fix them. And so a lot of places, unfortunately, like people just don't want to know how bad problems are, because then it creates a need to do something about it. And in the CEI hub, like this is something that like it just keeps happening. Like a report will come out and then like everyone's like, oh no, that's really bad, or an oil train will derail in Mosier, and everyone will go, oh yeah, I better do something. And then they like, when they're like, oh, this will be a big lift here, a pretty intensive policy process, people lose their appetite for wanting to do it. So without that like concerted and consistent grassroots of like making it happen, it's not going to happen. We basically have to force it to happen. Question from Maria: participatory budgeting fell short. I guess is a comment. Participatory budgeting fell short in the Charter Commission too because of a short vote. I think somebody was sick on that day. Yeah, and now that participatory budgeting is going to be on the ballot probably as an initiative because there's a good group of people that are advancing that. Can you give a quick overview of the Sustainability and Climate Commission as a new governance structure? It will be quick because I am not knowledgeable enough to tell you anymore. But what Maria is referring to is that we used to have a Planning and Sustainability Commission, which was a one of the good things that Sam Adams has done, was kind of like understanding that not having sustainability built into our planning processes was bad for making decisions. And I've talked to some people who were involved in assenting to splitting planning off from sustainability and climate again, and they're very optimistic that this was a good decision. The staff members of the city of Portland, who will likely be really influential, are good people, so that makes me optimistic. But I have to say, I really liked having the Planning and Sustainability Commission be together, because it meant that like our climate votes and our climate advocacy was like changing the zoning code, which is really, really important from my perspective. And so when it's not in the zoning code, it's not being enforced through land use decisions, it's like actually not as straightforward as it could be. So I liked that system. I think what happened, actually, what broke it, there were people were fighting over different things, but we mobilized the Planning and Sustainability Commission over Zenith. And I think it pissed off a lot of people in the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, but there was like a youth commissioner named Jesse Gittemeyer and Eli Spivak and some other people who were like, when all the Zenith stuff was going on, they actually like were pressuring the city from the inside to deny Zenith's Lux. And I think that just like pissed everybody off. So that was one of the impetuses for them wanting to change things, I think, as well, unfortunately. But it was good organizing. So it's too bad they responded that way. But yeah, it's something to keep an eye on. They just approved that new structure, so it will be built out, you know, between now and the new commission taking place and afterward. Other questions? Go ahead, Sam.
I'll ask a question. Yeah, so in Eugene, if I'm correct, the electricity is municipalized in Eugene, right? Unlike in Portland.
It's not municipalized, but they do have a public utility out.
It's chartered by the city or something.
No, I think it exists is like I think it's a PUD, a public utility district. I
Okay.
think, don't quote me on that. There are different kind of like categories, like municipal would mean like the city would own it. And I don't think that's the case in Eugene. I think it's like a separate entity that has its own board and operates independently of the
Mhm.
city.
Okay.
And then they sell to the city and then other users. And they buy from BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was curious if maybe the hostility on the natural gas ban is partially that it would have shifted it to a more public utility, a public facing, public owned utility or something.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was definitely, I mean, I don't live in Eugene, so I was following this stuff from afar, but it seemed like there were some interesting politics within the EWEB, Eugene Water and Electric Board. But I think a lot of it honestly had to do with the general manager is just like kind of like an older retired guy who really likes gas. And so like he's not very forward thinking about the future. And that includes things like dam removal and other things. But he was very unhelpful to discussions from his position at UWeb because we were like, yeah, it would make a lot of sense. Like UWeb would have more customers, you get more like money, like you could do a lot more stuff. We've got this Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure stuff that can come help them like build out resources. It's like all the things are like coming together at exactly the right time for eWeb to like step forward. And their general manager would like kind of like sabotage or attempt to sabotage people, and it like looked a lot like he was doing it on behalf of the gas industry, like he was buddies with the gas industry. So they were like he would just say things in meetings and stuff that would just be like, what, like that's not defensible, but like because as a general manager of the utility throwing it in there, it has like massive effect on discussions and things like that. But and the
So
general
was he
manager,
saying
oh, go ahead.
was he saying that like they wouldn't have capacity or something?
He would do stuff like, yeah, some of that like around capacity issues, but it wasn't like factually defensible, just kind of like off the cuff stuff. And then he would also just like out of nowhere start talking about like, oh, do you know there's this technology called like a gas-fired heat pump, you know? And it's just like, are you doing advertisements for like the gas industry? Like, what are you talking about? Because there'd be conversations around heat pumps, electric heat pumps
Yeah.
are very highly efficient stuff. So yeah, just stuff like that. It was very strange. We got some public records around it and stuff, but yeah, it kind of became moot after they had to take the ordinance off because we won either way, even with the pressure, we had got what we wanted and we're moving in the right direction, but got submarined by the courts.
And Ben put a question in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see that.
The question about the IRA. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. So I was meeting with BPS a couple of days ago, and I brought this question up to them, and I didn't get a concrete answer. So I'm curious if you happen to know anything. So do you happen to know if any Inflation Reduction Act money will be able to come down to the city? And if so, how and when and what that process is, and whether any advocacy or work can be done around it?
The answer is yes. If they want it, they can get it. Basically, if they're willing to be creative enough at designing the structures for it. My understanding is that PSAF has already set something like $20 million aside for the city to explore projects that they can get federal matching dollars for and all this stuff. But I mean, I think Mitch did a good job of describing this a couple sessions ago, but like just kind of like thinking out of the box, like it's actually something that the BPS chair brought up at the hearing, the PSAF hearing yesterday, I guess yesterday. He was like, we're not investing in like, you know, buying we're not building solar arrays in Eastern Oregon, right? We're doing climate justice projects here. Like we could do that, but we're not. It's like, yeah, we could actually do that. And I think there are structures that are called revolving funds that cities use for like housing. It's like a tested idea that exists out in the world. Like the city could create a revolving fund with PSAF or other money and basically like, you know, like be a main investor in renewable energy projects, be like a primary owner, get all of these tax credits out of the IRA, get, you know, paid back at the end of the next tax year for all this money that they spend, and then just like sell the resources, get the benefits from it, and put that money back in the revolving fund. Like there's stuff like that they could do with interest earning investments, and just like because the terms of the IRA for forgiving or for tax credits for these projects are so forgiving. Like that's absolutely something. And so the city has this big capital fund sitting around, which is very unique compared to any other city. So anyway, it's like there are details, technical details around stuff like that, but conceptually, if there's a will, there's a way while the IRA is still there for us.
Do you think, though, that there's anything we in the advocacy activist community could do to help draw that money down or be involved in any of it?
I mean, in the immediate term, I think like PSAF applications is the way to get involved. Like, because, and Maria could maybe say more about this, but the Portland Clean Energy Fund is amazing. Like it has like study grants, it has capacity building grants. Like if people have ideas and they just need like a little bit of resources to like make them into big ideas, PSAF basically like allows for community groups to team up and like dream huge and then come back to PSAF like having had their proposals more or less like paid for by PSAF to ask for more money. And so this resource is unbelievable. It's so unique. And so people with big ideas and like technical know-how like can get together and just like pitch big dream type ideas. So I think that's the vehicle for making it happen, because there's money there and it's a community-based fund. It does like pressure people to ensure that the projects are like climate justice based and that there's like marginalized communities are like having a big say in design and getting benefits and stuff like that. But I think that's good, like to force that kind of like community organizing and idea generation. So that's my first recommendation, is to like become knowledgeable about PSAF and engage it, because there's resources. And then secondarily, I would say get involved in the political process so that we have a really good city council. Because I think that's important. Maybe I'm like too down on this city council, but I don't think so. I I don't think like the council is going to be focusing on being really helpful. So, but there are friendly city officials that work in like the Bureau of Planning, Sustainability and stuff. So I think like, yeah, you just gotta like find a couple people who are like really motivated in those administrations too. And then you match up like motivated personnel with like movement energy. And
Mm,
that's always a really good recipe in this city as well,
thanks.
for sure. What's this
I
link?
feel like I've noticed a like kind of a almost 90s style triangulation politics happening. And so maybe we should just get as radical as possible with our proposals and like make the thing that we actually want the reasonable middle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, the link that I put was the session 2, in case you wanted to share that, because I do think that the IRA stuff is really well covered in that session.
Awesome. Thank you.
So there was actually a question in the Q&A box from Ben.
Great.
Can you access that? Yeah.
Yeah. So as earlier we talked a little bit about how insulated the current city council is in the post-Zoom world. Can we expect to have better accessibility to influence a new city council with district-based structure? I know city councilors will have offices. Can we expect to be able to better influence, make our voices heard in the new city structure outside elections? Yes and no. So I think that just in terms of the personalities who have put their hats in the ring, it seems people like are way more interested in like being community focused and just the style of electioneering. Basically, like now we have like 4 smaller towns that have elections going on in them now. And I grew up in a small town. My dad was a politician, and that means you just like gotta knock on doors and talk to people, which I think is great for our politics. It means that people are going to be accessible every 4 years, 2 years in case the first city council gets elected. They're gonna have to go and like do it again. And so they're just gonna, it's gonna like force them to be more community oriented. Um, that being said, one of the trade-offs of our new system is that under the current system, you only have to have 3 out of 5 votes for most issues. And that's actually with like good organizing and a halfway decent council, that's not that hard to do. And now we have to get 7, and so like the organizing, like you have to convince 4 more people to understand your issue and want to do it. And I think that might not come as easily as people think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that that could be like one of the trade-offs is like it's a little bit harder to get everybody on board for the things that we want to do. And yeah, I mean, if there's a bad council, by our standards of what we wanted to climate stuff, then we're kind of in a similar position, right? Like you got to get majority in order to govern. Let's see. Maria says in Discord, Nat had a question about tree planting. She says, see SP8 in the chart, $40 million over 5 years to plant trees through PSEF. That's great. Yeah, look at this, the gem. Nobody else has a program like that where we can just be like, all right, let's go. I heard somebody tell me that it's been like, it's from 350 told me that people have been doing advocacy for like more tree cover since like for it's like 80 years or something like that in Portland, and it hasn't been taken seriously. We did like Friends of Trees, and then that became like a private offshoot, but yeah. Other questions that folks have? Okay.
All right. So my day-to-day work is in land use and housing in particular. And I frankly love that the state has so much more um, local control than in other places, or preemption, basically. That they set the standards. Um, and if I don't know if it looks like maybe Sam had to drop off, but there had previously been efforts to get climate as a statewide land use planning goal. So one of the kind of main things that a city has to consider in any land use decision that they make. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that, or I know that a lot of people in the state would say that well, we solve that through the other land use planning goals. The other land use planning goals already support climate, but I'm wondering if you think that there should be an explicit climate goal.
Yeah, 100%. I think that would be really helpful. I think if there was a climate goal, it would be a lot harder to do things like permitting oil terminals, for example. Yeah. And, you know, Oregon does have this really cool land use system that in most cases is very helpful with things. Sometimes it's hard, but where we basically chose to go in that direction instead of a direction that other states went, which was to create a state environmental protection act, which created a whole bunch of like procedures that applicants for new big projects have to go through. That's analogous to the National Environmental Protections Act, or NEPA. So like Washington has a really good SEPA. And so a lot of their climate related regulation at the state level comes through that like process forcing law, and they forces a lot of like study of like carbon emissions and stuff. We don't have anything like that in Oregon. Our environmental laws are quite poor in Oregon, actually, because we're a resource extraction state, not oil and coal, but logs basically, and farm related food growing stuff. So yeah, I would love to have a land use goal in our climate goal in our land use laws. Would love to have a state NEPA equivalent. I hear that there's going to be an effort to try to like put a constitutional amendment right to the environment on the ballot in next year, I think. That could be interesting depending on what the text says. And I have more thoughts about that, but yeah, we do need big like state level reforms. And it's hard because I mean, maybe it will be different with like campaign finance stuff being phased in, but like I said, like Northwest Natural, Climate Villain is like the second biggest campaign contributor, and they're doing all this stuff. So, and the legislature, it works. Like if you throw money around at the legislature, absolutely works. So, yeah, we'll see. Hopefully that will change.
Right. And Derek put a bit in the Q&A.
Yeah, this question from Derek says, I'm sorry if I missed this, but any comments about Renee Gonzalez's recent thoughts on PSAF? I can never resist an opportunity to take a dig at Renee Gonzalez. So I'll just say that he looks stupid. And Bike Portland, Jonathan Mouse cut a video and put it on Twitter. He maybe put it on Instagram too, just kind of like having Renee's comments versus the chair of the Bureau of Planning Sustainability's responses. And I think it's just worth a watch. If you're inclined as I am, you will enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, I guess he was kind of what I was referring to in the triangulation piece, though, you know, in terms of the camping ordinance, recent camping ordinance, you know, he throws out something that's completely insane, and then Wheeler's proposal looks reasonable by comparison, you know, and I'm worried that that's kind of just the direction that things are going, that he gets to be a convenient villain when, you know, the other things that are happening are still regressive, still dehumanizing, but they look reasonable by comparison.
Yeah, I mean, you could make an argument that the right wing basically just like took the effective strategies of the progressives that were elected from like 2016 on and just like inverted them, right? Because like when Udaley and Hardesty were on the council, they never had a majority of progressives, but they were able to like when Udaley got elected, she got the housing like rent. It wasn't rent control, but it was like basically you have to pay moving costs if you're a landlord and you're evicting people. So it was like functional rent control. And like nobody else on that council wanted to pass that, but one progressive who was like knowledgeable and good at working with movements was enough to mobilize people and like get the press there and all the rest. And Renee Gonzalez is dumber and is not actually a good organizer and has no attention span to actually follow through on anything. So thank goodness he's failed on most of the things that he's tried to do. I mean, they did get a updated camping ban, which sucks, but that he has failed basically like on 90% of the things that he's tried to do. So we're lucky that he's incompetent, but I totally see what you're saying. And then in the chat, Maria's linking the PSEF work session from yesterday. Yeah, I mean, I watched some of it. I haven't seen it all, but it looked really good. So for folks who are interested in PSEF would. And also you can just like, PSEF has so many good materials on their website for just like becoming familiar with like the granting process and how to get involved. And so like, it's just like money that's sitting there that they just are eager to give to creative community projects. So it's kind of a shame that so few just like, people in the grassroots are figuring this out. So the more people that know about it, the better. So just learn. Like if you have a cool idea, maybe you can get it funded by PSEF. Any other last questions before we shut it down for the night? Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I hope it was informative and useful. I am always happy to talk to you in great detail about any of these subjects I brought up tonight or anything else. Next week, we're doing power building. And so we're actually gonna, Damon Mott's story is the new executive or chapter coordinator is the term at the Oregon Sierra Club. They've been active in climate struggle here for a long time, and they're going to talk about the organizing that went into Portland Clean Energy Fund. And yeah, we're just going to talk about like building power and mobilizing more generally, because I think honestly, most important thing right now, can't legislate, can't do anything if you don't have the juice. So we got to get the juice back. So that's where we're going next week. Yeah, I'm excited for it. So I guess I'll see you all then. Thanks a lot.